A new virus spreads around the world, infecting millions, sickening hundreds of thousands, and disrupting the lives of nearly every person on the planet. Global stock markets crashed, causing a worldwide depression and sending millions to the unemployment line. Racial tensions in the United States flare up, leading to rioting and mass demonstrations across the country. Tensions in Eastern Europe escalate between Armenia and Azerbaijan into a full-scale war. These are all disparate events that took place in history over the 1920s, 30s, 60s, and 90s, and they all occurred again in just the last 12 months. To say that 2020 was a busy news year would be an understatement. In this video, we take a look back at the year that was 2020. I'm standing outside the Richmond Road Medical Clinic. Facilities such as this one have become ground zero in the fight against a worldwide pandemic, the likes of which our planet has not seen in more than a century. Beginning in 2019, reports out of Wuhan, China began to emerge of a new, as yet unidentified coronavirus. China would respond by locking down first the city and then the entire country. And while they would be successful at controlling the epidemic within China, the virus had already spread outside the country's borders, with reports of outbreaks being reported in Italy, Japan, and South Korea as early as January. By March, the virus, now named COVID-19, was in full circulation around the world and would be officially declared a pandemic by the World Health Organization. As Italy locked down, placing its entire population under quarantine, the World Health Organization declared Europe the new active center of the pandemic, and the entire EU would close its borders on March 17th in an effort to prevent new cases from entering the region. While Italy would be the first European hotspot, recording some 70,000 cases by the end of March, the virus would rapidly spread to other European countries, including Spain, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, all of which were particularly badly hit. While the virus continued to ravage Europe, it was also beginning to spread in the United States, a country governed by the notorious science-denying Donald Trump. While most countries would impose lockdowns, quarantines, and mandatory mask orders, the response in the United States was disorganized at best and overtly malicious at worst. During the initial stages of the outbreak, personal protective equipment was in comically short supply, bad information and fake news was being broadcast on the airwaves, and the messaging from the White House was that the virus would magically vanish. The virus did not disappear, and the United States rapidly became the worst affected country, recording more than 19 million cases and 300,000 deaths by the end of the year. Just like the United States, Brazil is led by an extremist right-wing leader who is notorious for denying science. Consequently, the virus response in Brazil was almost as bad as the US, causing it to become the third worst affected country with more than 7 million cases and nearly 200,000 deaths. By November, there was finally some good news to report. Vaccines for the virus, which had been in development most of the year, were finally finishing the final stages of testing. By the end of 2020, the Western world was tracking 3 vaccine candidates, one from Pfizer-BioNTech, one from Moderna, and a third created by Oxford University and AstraZeneca. There is a 4th vaccine as well, the Russian-produced Sputnik V, which is reportedly also highly effective. As 2021 begins, mass vaccination campaigns are ramping up across the world, which could lead to an easing of lockdown restrictions over the coming months. While the public health impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has been shocking, the impact on the global economy has been no less horrifying. With people under some of the most restrictive stay-at-home orders since the end of the Second World War, businesses have understandably taken a massive financial hit, leading to an economic recession worse than that of 2008 and similar to that of the Great Depression in the 1930s. In March, the Dow Jones fell by a staggering 12.9%, adding on to some already massive losses from earlier in the year. In April, the International Monetary Fund warned that the global economy was expected to shrink by at least 3%, and with global travel all but entirely halted, demand for oil shrank, leading to a price crash and the lowest price for a barrel of oil seen since 2002. Oftentimes, there is a disconnect between what happens on the stock market and what happens in the real world, but in this case, the situation for the average person was also very bad. As lockdowns progressed, businesses began shutting down and laying off or furloughing employees. In the United States, which has a very weak social safety net, the effect was immediately palpable. Unemployment claims skyrocketed and lines for food banks stretched for blocks. While governments around the world have tried to lessen the impact of the economic crisis by introducing billions of dollars of stimulus, and in some cases putting a hold on evictions and foreclosures, the effects of the economic crisis are still being fully understood, and will likely continue to create hardship for millions of people well into the future. On May 26th, thousands of protesters took to the streets of Minneapolis to protest against the police killing of George Floyd. Floyd was a 46-year-old African-American man who was killed by a police officer on May 25th after having his neck compressed for more than 8 minutes. The 4 officers arresting Floyd made no effort to save him, even after he became motionless for more than 2 minutes. The killing sparked some of the largest protests and civil unrest in the United States since the 1960s, and at its peak, more than 2,000 cities across the country took part in demonstrations calling for an end to police brutality and institutionalized racism against African Americans. While the vast majority of the protests were peaceful, in some cases the demonstrations devolved into rioting, looting, and skirmishes with police. In response to the small number of violent demonstrations, the National Guard was mobilized in many states, and Donald Trump even threatened to unleash the U.S. military on civilian populations. In June, Trump signed an executive order that allowed the Department of Homeland Security to extend its jurisdiction to include domestic targets. And not long after, there were reports from Portland, Oregon, of unidentified federal thugs abducting, beating, and unlawfully detaining protesters on orders from the White House. Authoritarian dictatorships across the world, including Russia and China, capitalized on the opportunity to say that the United States was no better than them when it came to crushing peaceful demonstrations. And they had a point. While the protests have, for the most part, fallen into the background as the COVID-19 story took over the dominant news cycle, none of their demands have really been met. With several more high-profile police killings of African Americans, the tinderbox that is race relations in the United States remains on the precipice of being ignited again. In December of 2019, Donald Trump became the 3rd U.S. president in history to be impeached. Trump's impeachment was based on charges of abuse of power and obstruction of Congress relating to attempts by the Trump administration to coerce Ukraine into providing damaging information on Trump's Democratic presidential challenger, Joe Biden. On January 16th, the articles of impeachment were submitted to the Senate, where a trial would take place. In the Republican-controlled Senate, the impeachment proceedings would fail, with Republican senators taking the ostrich approach of burying their heads in the sand and refusing to hear from witnesses or reviewing any documents. Trump was acquitted by the Senate on February 5th, the result demonstrating the inexplicable control Trump wields over the Republican Party. Staying in the United States, and 2020 was a presidential election year, and this election was one of the most bizarre and vitriolic in recent history. The election would see a record number of mail-in and absentee ballots as a result of the ongoing pandemic. This election would also mark the first time that a president would attempt to interfere with electoral proceedings. Since mail-in ballots usually favor Democratic candidates, Trump attempted to discredit the proceedings by falsely claiming the process was vulnerable to abuse, despite the fact that he himself voted by mail. The campaign was one of the most vitriolic in history, and the debates were something to behold, with more childish screaming than actual debate. Eventually, the vote would happen on November 3rd, and because of the high number of mail-in votes, it would be several days before the results were officially announced. Finally, Joe Biden, the Democratic presidential candidate, was declared winner, but Trump has yet to actually concede the election and is still falsely claiming the vote was fraudulent. Trump's petulance has affected the smooth transition of power, as Biden's transition team has not been granted access to many of the documents and security briefings usually afforded to the president-elect, and it remains to be seen whether Trump will vacate the White House peacefully in January or have to be forced out by the Secret Service. In December of 2019, the United Kingdom, led by the bombastic Boris Johnson, officially left the European Union and began a 12-month transition period in which the UK's policies and procedures would be closely aligned to that of the EU. The transition period is designed as a period of stability for business and travel, while the two sides negotiated a permanent trade agreement. As is customary in all things Brexit, the negotiations would be dominated by lines in the sand, missed deadlines, and down-to-the-wire negotiations. A formal deal would finally be agreed to on Christmas Eve, just 1 week before the UK was due to crash out of the European Union, causing a massive trade disruption. On December 28th, EU member states voted to approve the deal, and the only remaining hurdles are procedural at this point. Against all odds, it would seem that the UK will successfully leave the European Union without causing too much irreparable harm to their economy. On August 4th, a massive explosion ripped through the port of Beirut, causing a wave of death and destruction across the Lebanese capital. The explosion killed 204 people, injured 6,500, and left as many as 300,000 people homeless. Subsequent investigations have revealed that the cause of the explosion was improperly stored ammonium nitrate, which had been confiscated some 6 years prior. The Lebanese political system is infamous for corruption and mismanagement, and the mishandling of the ammonium nitrate was just the latest example of such problems. In response to the incident, the entire Lebanese government resigned, although the new government is widely expected to face some of the same issues. On January 3rd, a U.S. drone strike near the Baghdad International Airport struck and killed Iranian Major General Kassam Suleimani. Suleimani was infamous in the region for growing Iran's influence through political interference and was a major figure in Iran. In response to the killing of the general, Iran launched a series of missile strikes against U.S. bases in Iraq. Although no one was killed during the retaliation, several U.S. military personnel are said to have been treated for major brain injuries. In the hours following the attack, Ukrainian Airlines Flight 752 crashed shortly after taking off from Tehran International Airport. The Iranian government initially denied any involvement in the crash, but subsequent investigation and release of video footage eventually forced the Iranian authorities to admit they shot down the plane. All 176 people on board were killed. It has not been made immediately clear why Iran shot the plane down, although it is widely believed that the Iranian military was on high alert following the missile strikes and had possibly misidentified the plane as a U.S. attack. Racial violence erupted in Ethiopia's Tigray region in November after Ethiopian soldiers came under attack by TPLF rebels in the region. In retaliation, Ethiopia responded by shutting down the government in the region and launching a series of attacks against the TPLF. The conflict sparked a regional refugee crisis after more than 1 million people were forced to flee the fighting. In May, China imposed a controversial national security law on Hong Kong, effectively ending its independence from China and marking the end of the one country, two systems policy. Under the new law, Hong Kong citizens are subject to the same restrictions and surveillance as mainlanders, and protesters can be charged as terrorists. Tensions between Armenia and Azerbaijan bubbled over in September when war broke out between the two countries over the disputed Nagorno-Karabakh region. The region, which is the territory that lies between the two countries, has been under dispute since the late 1980s. While the wide belief is that the Azerbaijani side, supported by Turkey, started the conflict, both sides have blamed the other for initiating the violence. Fighting continued for nearly 2 months until a ceasefire was agreed on November 10th. Under the ceasefire, Armenia would cede much of the territory it had controlled since the early 90s, and a Russian peacekeeping force would be deployed to maintain stability in the region. Protesters took to the streets of Belarus in August after presidential elections in the former Russian state. The incumbent president, Alexander Lukashenko, claimed victory in the election, a result which has been widely disputed. Over the next several weeks, anti-government protests built in intensity, culminating in days of disruption across the country. In response to the demonstrations, the government brought in troops and Secret Service who have been accused of torture and unlawful detainment. Demonstrations are still ongoing in the country, and opposition leaders have either been detained or exiled to neighboring countries. The year started with record-setting wildfires in Australia, widely believed to be exacerbated by the effects of climate change. More than 18 million hectares were scorched, destroying almost 6,000 buildings and killing 34 people. Wildlife was particularly affected by the crisis, with delicate ecosystems being upset and some endangered species believed to have been driven to extinction. By March, the thousands of extra firefighters that had been brought in from around the world had the situation under control, but with ongoing climate change prompting more extreme weather conditions around the world, experts worry that the 2020 fire season could become the new normal for Australia. The United States is well known for mass shootings, but in April, the Canadian province of Nova Scotia gained notoriety after a deranged gunman went on a shooting rampage, killing 22 people. The incident began on April 18th following a fight between the perpetrator and his spouse. After handcuffing his partner and setting their house on fire, the perpetrator took flight in a replica police vehicle and began a shooting rampage across the province. Police have been criticized for failing to adequately inform the public of the incident and their initial response to the crisis. The gunman was eventually located and shot by police on April 19th. In October, Samuel Pate, a middle school teacher in France, was beheaded by a refugee after showing cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad during a class on freedom of speech. The incident would spark a wave of Islamist-inspired attacks in France, including a stabbing at a church in Nice and a shooting in Lyon. In the aftermath of the attacks, the French government would be criticized by Islamic nations for being anti-Muslim. On Christmas Day, a suspected suicide bombing in Nashville, Tennessee occurred, causing a massive amount of damage to the city's historic district. Motivation for the attack is unknown, as a warning of the impending explosion was broadcast over loudspeakers, giving people in the area enough time to evacuate. Police investigations have zeroed in on a 63-year-old man who is being described as a person of interest. Canada experienced political unrest in January after demonstrators in solidarity with Aboriginal chiefs blocked highways and railways across the country. The issue is complex and centers around the creation of a natural gas pipeline in northern British Columbia. Although the elected leaders of the Aboriginal band were in favor of the pipeline, many Canadian First Nations don't recognize the elected officials' authority, and instead threw their support to traditional chiefs who opposed the pipeline. Eventually, a memorandum of understanding between affected Aboriginal bands and the Canadian and British Columbian governments would be signed, paving a way forward for continued negotiations on the project. India has experienced unrest several times throughout the year, the first incidents occurring in February when rioting and looting took place in northeast Delhi. The riots were largely caused by Hindu mobs attacking Muslims, and the victims and property damage were largely skewed against Muslims. Under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, India has become increasingly nationalistic and intolerant of other religions. India would again experience unrest in September after the Indian Parliament passed a new law deregulating much of the farming industry. India's agricultural industry is largely dominated by small, independent farmers, many of whom believe the new law would put them at the mercy of large corporations and push them further into poverty. Protests have been ongoing since September and culminated in a general strike on November 26th. Tensions between two nuclear-armed neighbors, China and India, erupted in June when skirmishes broke out between troops in the Galwan Valley. In the bizarre incident, it is reported that hand-to-hand combat broke out between the two sides, involving up to 600 people. As many as 14 were killed in the incident, and thankfully it did not result in an escalation of tensions. 3 Arab countries, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Sudan, agreed to normalize relations with Israel following U.S.-brokered negotiations. The move, which has been condemned by Palestinians, marks the first time in decades that any significant progress has been made towards a peace deal. Turkey made headlines in July when President Recep Tayyip Erdogan ordered the historic Hagia Sophia to be converted into a mosque. The cathedral, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, has been officially a museum since 1934. The conversion is just the latest in a series of steps undertaken by the Turkish authorities in recent years to push Turkey towards becoming an Islamic nation. In Thailand, thousands of protesters took to the streets to demonstrate against the monarchy. Thailand has some of the most oppressive monarchy laws in the world, and even criticizing the monarchy publicly can lead to someone getting a lengthy prison sentence. Demonstrators are calling for an abolition of the restrictive anti-monarchy laws and a reform to the monarchy as a whole. And in January, a large swathe of the Philippines was forced to evacuate after the Taal volcano erupted, spewing ash and magma into the surrounding area. 39 deaths have been attributed to the eruption. And those are the stories that caught our attention in 2020. As the year draws to a close, I'm sure everyone is pretty happy to say good riddance to what overall has been a pretty shit year. From all of us here at INET, thanks for watching, Happy New Year, and here's to better times in 2021.